This was beyond seasick. This was pure misery. I didn't know a person could be that miserable. It was awful. By far, it was the worst experience of my life. We're anchored in a pretty snug spot, but there's a bit of fetch, so we're getting some chop built up. It's probably a couple hundred yards to the beach, which is upwind, so there's enough fetch to be creating a little bit of chop. But the anchor's holding well, so I'm not really worried or anything. We got a pretty good spot here. It's not blowing all that hard either. It's maybe blowing 20 miles an hour, 25 at the gusts a little bit, so not bad really. We make all of our own water with the water maker, but we like to keep it sort of handy in water bottles so we can drink from it. And so I just made this, the water in this jug yesterday, and I'm filling these jugs. And then I'm gonna pour some into the water tank as well. We have an onboard water tank that's 18 gallons. We've probably used 5 out of it since we filled it. It's hard to do without spilling that first little bit. We've got a pretty windy anchorage. It's fairly protected. We're behind an island, but we've still got enough fetch that it's kicking up some good 2-foot chop. Our problem is we draw 5 feet of water, so we can't always get as close to the beach as we'd like for protection. The other problem that we have with this particular boat is it's got a lot of windage forward, which is made worse by the fact that it's a fractionally rigged sloop, so the mast is further forward than with a masthead sloop, and so it sails at anchor terribly. It'll turn itself a full 90 degrees to the wind. So I've been trying to figure out ways to get more windage at the back. It doesn't take a whole lot, you just have to balance the windage at the front. So what I've done is I tilted the solar panels up. They're on hinges and they pivot to 3 positions, level and then up and down to try and catch the sun. And I just flipped them up on end, you can see, and it's just enough that it's made quite a big difference. It's probably eliminated about 20 degrees to our swing overall, enough that we're not turning broadside to the wind and waves nearly as much, and it's actually made us a lot calmer. I'm gonna see if I can do something to maybe pick up a little more windage aft still, but I was really pleased that that made as much difference as it did. I sewed some grommets into our American flag to try and give us just a little more windage aft, to keep us straighter into the wind. That was about the last footage we had for the day. The wind actually started picking up even more, and more problematic is it started clocking around the island, so the anchorage started getting rougher and rougher.
The wind was originally coming from the east, blowing towards Bird Island, and Bird Island was protecting us. And so as the wind was clocking around to the south, heading north, we were getting the ocean swells, and it was building up pretty significantly.
Yeah, and the really difficult part about that particular spot is you've got one of those really deep Bahama trenches right there. So the swells get really large, and then it hits a really narrow shelf right where we were anchored. So it was actually developing into a pretty dangerous situation where we could have been anchored in actual breakers 12 foot high. It was sketchy.
Yeah, and to make it even worse, this all happened right when the sun was setting.
Yeah. And there was nowhere else nearby to hide. The problem with this string of islands is there's no backside. The Berry Islands really is just the edge of a bank that's too shallow to get on the backside of, so there was nowhere to run to.
I made my way to the front of the boat to pull up the anchor while Randall got the engine running and everything. And we really just had to get out of there as quickly as possible because we had these breakers coming in at us. And so the bow was bouncing. So crazy. Like, it was so hard to hold on to.
Oh, when you were pulling the anchor, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I got the anchor up though, and we started motoring.
Straight out to sea, straight into the breakers. We were actually really scared to turn sideways to them at all because they were, like I said, they were 12 foot tall and almost breaking. They were just almost sloughing at the tops and really steep.
Yeah, so we were getting right to the shelf of where these swells were beginning to break, and just looking out over and seeing this huge wave towering over the Dodger coming right at us. And I was trying so hard not to cry because I was just so scared, but I couldn't hold it in, and I was just crying, and I was asking Randall, just tell me it's gonna be okay, please tell me it's gonna be okay, because this was my number one worst nightmare. I kept asking Randall to call into the marina just to see if we could come in from the storm. They told us that the marina had been destroyed in Hurricane Matthew, and so
there was a cable across the entrance. You couldn't even get in.
Yeah, and there was one boat anchored in there already, and with the way the wind was gonna start blowing in from the south, they didn't think there would be room for both of us, and so they basically just said, tough luck.
So our only real option was to spend the night at sea in this storm which kicked up, and it really caught us by surprise. We didn't have everything stowed properly below. We didn't have the cover off the mainsail. We would have liked to have got the mainsail, but by the time we got out of the anchorage and out of the open ocean, it was so rough we couldn't even go onto the foredeck. It was really bad. The wind piped up to over 35 knots, probably 40.
It was hauling. It was so windy.
And the swells got really big. We had green water coming over the bow, and it was really rough.
Once we got out to open ocean, I started feeling a lot better.
And I started feeling a lot worse.
For me, it was just like being in Oregon on the rough water, and I was used to that, and I was comfortable with the motion of being on these large swells. And so even though it was nighttime, that was scary, but the overall, knowing that we were out in open ocean, we weren't worrying about being, crashed into the land or anything.
The real risk was over. We'd sailed in 12-foot seas.
Right.
We'd sailed in 35 knots of wind. So it was a lot less stressful.
We are out here in the middle of the ocean, getting tossed around. Randall looks up to the front of the boat, and the anchor's gone.
Oh, yeah, I forgot.
And he goes, Kenzie, did you not tie down the anchor?
Did you latch the anchor?
And I was like, no, was that something I needed to do? I didn't know. I usually don't pull up the anchor. I felt so bad, and I was like, I'll go up there and I'll pull it in, and Randall refused. He was like, no, I'll go up there. And we had our gear on. We had our life jackets and our harnesses, and we were very careful.
And a radio and a whistle.
Yeah, we were very careful to be clipped in at all times. So we turned downwind to give Randall a gentler ride so he could climb up front and pull up the anchor and tie it down. So that was my mistake. If you're in rough water, always lash down your anchor.
Yeah.
Shortly after that, we had large waves crashing over the top of the boat, and Randall was getting the blow of it. He was soaking wet.
Yeah.
And he got to the point, he's like, I am freezing cold. I need another coat on.
Yeah. And
I had been going down below, closing windows and hatches and all of the sea cocks and everything. And so I would have went down and got him his jacket. The only problem was his harness clips are on his life jacket. So he would have had to take his life jacket completely off to put his coat on. So he had to go down below to put it on anyway. Safely. And that is, I think, when you got seasick.
Yeah,
you
probably.
Came back up done.
Yeah.
After that,
true.
you were so seasick.
I didn't stop puking for probably 2.5, 3 hours.
Yeah, it was a long time.
Yeah, and then of course at a certain point it's just dry heaving, which is even more painful. But that was pretty miserable.
Yeah.
So we eventually made our way far enough from the island and eastward so that we didn't have a lee shore, which took several hours, because motoring into this weather, I mean, the best we could do was about 3.5 knots, I think.
If even that.
Yeah, at times we were doing like under 2 knots. It was really, really difficult to make any headway. But we were nervous that if the wind picked up any more, we wouldn't be able to make any headway, and we'd get blown right onto the island. And like I said, I would have preferred to have just put up a reef in the mainsail, and the boat actually does really well in those circumstances. High winds with a double reefed main, and it'll just inch its way, upwind really well. But it was, like I said, green water coming over the bow, and the deck was awash. It just wasn't safe to go up there.
Yeah.
And so we just kept motoring into it till we got away from the lee shore, and then we turned downwind, which was a little bit better motion. It always is going downwind. Under bare poles, we were going faster than I liked, and we were getting thrown around a lot. And we kind of had a quartering sea, which wasn't helping.
Randall is super seasick, and he is going to puke at any minute. And I was sitting on the port side, and so he wanted to come over and lay on my lap. And I just held him, and I kept rubbing his arm to let him know that I was here for him, because I was fine. I was not seasick at all.
And I was just doing everything I could not to throw up.
And I just felt so bad for him. And I was watching out for waves coming the best I could in the dark. And I couldn't see this one. And this huge wave came and just splashed in his face.
It wasn't like a spray. It was like
a physical
green
wave.
water, just pouring over me.
Oh, I felt so bad. And then after that, you're like, no, I'm not laying down anymore. Yeah. So then he moved back over to the starboard side to be on the windward side. And that's when you started throwing up. You couldn't hold it in anymore.
Yeah.
And he just leaned over the boat. And I was so scared that I was going to smell it. I was already hearing it.
Yeah.
And I was rubbing his leg, holding on to him. I'm like, I'm here for you. I'm so sorry you're seasick, but I don't want to get too close to you.
I don't want anything to do with you.
I do not want, because you smell it and you get that reflex. You're like, whoa. Yep. But yeah, he threw up 3 or 4 times
a minute
over the side of the boat. And that's when you were like, okay, I'm done. It was so crazy. He'd be sitting there in the cockpit, just dull face. He was out of it. He was delirious.
I was exhausted. I was so exhausted.
And so then he's like, okay, we need to put out the sea anchor.
I could barely verbalize my thoughts. I was so exhausted and sick.
like, okay. The sea anchor, though, we stow it in our cockpit locker, and it was at the very, very bottom. And so we are in
under the spare anchor and chain.
And buckets and ropes
fenders.
And all of our snorkeling gear.
That's right.
Everything is stuffed in this locker, and it's at the very, very bottom. And it's pitch black. So I have my little tiny headlight. I'm trying to put it on my head, but it's too big, so it keeps falling down. And so I'm trying to hold it in my mouth. Randall is just sitting there watching me. Going like this. Delirious. And I'm sitting here trying to pull out the anchor and the buckets and the rope, and I'm digging around and I'm trying to pull the sea anchor bag up and out. But it was so difficult in this sea because we were just being thrown around like rag dolls in a washing machine.
You couldn't even sit without holding on.
No,
it was rough.
It was so rough, and I was sitting there and yanking, and it was stuck inside this locker, and I'm tugging and I'm grunting. I'm like, ah, and I'm looking at Randall. Come on, help me already. You can see that I'm struggling. He just sits there.
I was trying not to throw up. I had to breathe really calmly, or I would just throw up.
Anyway, looking back now, I find it hilarious. But in the moment, I was like, dude, you better get your butt in gear and help me. But he just sat there, and I was like, fine, I'm going to do this for the both of us. And I yank it out, and I hand it to him, and he gets it all deployed while I put everything back into the locker. And as soon as he let the sea anchor out, the wind magnified, and it was just
Yeah, because we were no longer doing 7 knots with the wind.
And I was like,
we were actually
pull it
going
back in.
against the wind because the current and the wind were actually opposing. So we were actually doing probably 1.5 knots to windward. So there was
backwards.
Yeah, exactly. So
it was not pleasant.
There was probably 8 or 9 knots of wind speed that picked up. Plus we were actually moving into the swells physically.
Yeah. So I was like, pull it back in. It was better without it.
I would have laughed if I could have, because there's no pulling it back in.
But he gets the sea anchor deployed and immediately just goes down below.
Yeah, it was done.
And I am like...
We were set. We couldn't control our course. We couldn't affect anything else. So my work was finished.
So, but he just left me. He didn't tell me anything. So I'm left sitting there in the cockpit by myself. It's raining now. And the storm just got even worse. And
now the wind's coming from aft. So the Dodger doesn't provide any protection.
Right. And so I'm like... well, somebody's got to like keep watch, right? I'm like, watch out for these other boats around. Not that it'd make any difference. Like, what do I do? He just left me. And so like a few minutes later, he comes and pokes his head out. He's like, you should come down below. I'm like, okay. So as I'm climbing down the steps to go below, he's puking into the rice cooker.
Yeah, I just grabbed the rice cooker and puked in it.
And I was like, this is going to be a long night.
It was.
The inside of the boat, we did not stow anything. We didn't have time. This came upon us so quickly.
Yeah.
It was a mess inside. We had silverware on the floor, books all over the place. Pots and pans are like sliding all over the counter. The V-berth was full of all of our gear and it was just tumbling around and everything. When you're down inside the boat, every single sound is magnified and it is the most horrendous sound. You could hear the water, the waves crashing on top of the boat. You could hear the now empty space in the cockpit locker. You can hear the anchor just crashing against the wall.
The wind's howling.
And we needed to clear out the floor in the cockpit for the water to drain out. So we tied the gas cans and tossed them over the back.
Yeah.
And so we could hear them clinking and banging. And
not like into the water over the back.
Over the swim platform.
We lashed them onto the swim deck, yeah.
Yeah. But just the sounds are magnified. And it was just so horrendous hearing everything crashing. And
the wind has a really eerie sound when it starts blowing that hard. 40 knots of wind on a boat in the rigging, that's an eerie sound. It's crazy to hear.
And then on top of that, it's pitch black. Yeah. Like you can't see anything around you. It's a really weird feeling.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy.
Occasionally I would go back up outside and check the chart plotter and look for lights around us and
check the AIS broadcast for other ships.
Right, and at one point I did see 2 ships heading right toward us. They were about 16 miles away, and so I let Randall know, and he was just like, whatever. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'll give it a few minutes, and now they're 10 miles away from us, still heading straight for us. I made my first official radio call that night, and I called them and told them that we were adrift and I had all of the lights on, and just to let them know that we were there and don't crash into us. And they didn't. By the time the wind and the storm had calmed down enough, it was about 4 in the morning, and they were definitely closer. I could definitely make out their lights, but they weren't a threat to us anymore. Randall came up, the ocean had calmed down quite a bit. He was able to pull up the sea anchor.
I was able to sit up without puking again.
Yeah. You were still very out of it though.
Very seasick, very exhausted.
So we got the sea anchor up. We decided on an anchorage to go to. And the funny part was I'm trying to hand steer and we're going in circles, like literally. And the only reason why I know we're going in circles is because I can see the cruise ship's lights going around, and I'm like trying to like steer with the tiller. And so that's when you told me to get out the autopilot.
Yeah.
Put it on, set the course, and go. And I went really slow for you because you went back below and tried to sleep more. So I kept it really gentle until we got close to land, and I made you come up and help me go in through the channel. We found a nice protected area to drop anchor. We were greeted by 3 dolphins as I was dropping anchor, and the sun had come out. It was nice and sunny. We were in a calm spot.
Back to paradise.
And I was beat. I slept for like 7 hours straight. And then we watched a few movies, had some popcorn.
Yeah, and then
we went to bed, and I slept all night again.
Yeah.
I was just so exhausted.
Yeah.
That was the most miserable night. Oh, and we found 3 fish in the cockpit the next morning.
Oh yeah, 3 fish had washed into the boat. That's how much green water was coming in, not just over the deck, but over the deck, around the Dodger, and into the cockpit. It was just a wash.
They were just tiny fish.
But fish.
But still.
Yeah. Our boat handled it phenomenally. I mean, there was no hull flexing, there was no creaking. It was solid. We really never worried about the boat.
Nope.
That boat could have handled twice that easily. I would have given up and just jumped overboard. But the boat handled it really well. We were never worried about its seaworthiness and all of that. So that was one really nice comfort. To have been truly afraid of the ability for our boat to cope out there would have added an incomprehensible amount of stress to that ordeal. And another thing that really made a difference was our preparation. We'd been in big wind, we'd been in rough weather, we'd been in big swells in Oregon. We knew how it would handle in those situations, and we deployed our sea anchor before. We knew how to do it. We knew how far out it needed to be to ride on the swells properly. So the preparation really paid off for us in this situation.